Okie doke. Well, thank you everybody for joining Solar Noon Tuesday. And as per normal, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and go through the news of the week, essentially, and then I'll open it up to the floor as people join in to see if you have any issues or questions that we can touch on. Then I've got announcements of webinars and the like, and then we usually focus on a subject matter in brief during this meeting. And this time we're talking about whether utilities should be allowed to own and operate EV charging stations. It's actually quite a big issue in the industry at this particular moment. So let's jump into, oops, I picked up the wrong remote here. All right, so the news of the solar this week. Well, for the first time in history, a history of solar, that according to a report by Dartmouth College and Cambridge University, that it's actually cheaper now to buy American-made products than it is to import solar products from other countries like China. And this is all because of the Inflation Reduction Act. And this particular diagram over my shoulder here, or graph, shows sort of the pre-Inflation Reduction Act pricing structure, the post, and how it compares with international pricing. What this study projects is that because of these incentives, by the year 2035, we'll see about 2.5 million jobs added here to the U.S. economy in solar product manufacturing, just in solar product manufacturing. And then additionally, about 1.9 million jobs that are in the development and installation of solar projects. And one of the things that the IRA had was a prevailing wage requirement on all of these incentives. And so we're looking at these jobs, of course, being very well-paid jobs. Prevailing wage are essentially union wages. They do anticipate that the prevailing wage requirement will add about 20% to the labor costs of these installations. But because labor is such a small part of an installation, it will really only add about 3% to the overall cost of the solar installation. They're also projecting that we will see about $200 billion per year in wages being paid within the solar industry, again, by the year 2035. Canadian Solar, speaking of incentives, bringing companies to the United States, Canadian Solar announced they're opening their first manufacturing plant here in the United States. They're investing $250 million in a 5 gigawatt project in Mesquite, Texas. And they do anticipate this will be producing solar panels by the end of 2023. This will produce about 20,000 panels per day, and they're projecting it will add about 1,500 jobs in that local, for that local facility. Another new manufacturing facility that announced this week is Cubic PV. They announced that they've raised $200 million to build a 10 gigawatt solar wafer plant. Now, the wafers, the cells, as opposed to the panels themselves. Now, they haven't announced where it's going to be yet. They also think it's going to add about 1,500 new jobs. That seems to be the number this week. But currently, there is no solar wafer production capacity here in the United States. So this will be the very first solar wafer panel or manufacturing facility here in the U.S. And that's a result of the IRA as well. Speaking of public policy, the Department of the Interior has announced that they're changing some policies to promote the development of wind and solar on public lands, primarily out west. They're looking at reducing access fees by as much as 80%, and those fees will be reduced up until 2035. And they're also looking at extending these leases to time periods as long as 50 years. Since 2021, the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, has issued about 35 permits for projects in public lands. They have about 74 currently that are being reviewed. And another aspect of this whole process is they're looking at doing a study that identifies high potential sites for wind and solar. And then if installer wants to put a system there, they will fast track that on those high potential sites. So a lot of activity there. And then in the world of technology, First Solar has announced that they've just created a thin film bifacial solar panel, which is interesting. Prior to this, only silicon-based solar panels were bifacial. And bifacial, it's basically a panel that can absorb energy from the top of the panel, but also from the bottom of the panel. And since these cadmium telluride panels from First Solar are primarily utility scale, you may see, they are ground-mounted systems. So it definitely has some demand there. It also allows infrared light to pass through it. So they're claiming that this will then allow for these panels to operate cooler than they would otherwise, which is going to increase the efficiency of those systems. So that's the news from this week. Does anybody have anything they want to add to that, or any questions that you have that were burning a hole in your psyche during the week that we can address at this time? Give you just a second to unmute if you've got something to add in there. While you're thinking about that, and feel free to jump in, I did get Devin down in Trinidad and Tobago had asked about the difference between some of the, I don't remember the exact, but it was not between an MC4 connector and I think it was a WC4 connector. There are different MC4 like
WM4 connector.
WM4 connector. Okay, yeah. And basically what that is MC4 is a trade name, sort of like Kleenex or Xerox, where it is a specific brand. In fact, Staubli, which is a Swiss company, developed the MC4 connector. They own the right to call their connectors MC4. Nobody else has that right. So they have to say they're MC4-like connectors. So there may be no difference at all. I mean, there's going to be slight manufacturing differences. But one thing to bear in mind on those connectors is a lot of the problems we see in the field with fires and behavior problems on the various installations are due to mismatched connectors or field terminated connectors. So make sure that you're using a connector that's compatible with the connector that came with the solar panel if you're making any jumps. But essentially you're talking about the same thing, but it's just from a different manufacturer. Does that make sense, Devanan? So I see you're driving, so don't crash.
Hey, Jay, a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
I'm having trouble determining what's a compatible connector. Is there a spec on the fittings themselves or anything else? Because, for example, a panel I was just looking at, they only say MC4 connector. They don't say anything else about the terminal.
Oh, well, depending on that panel manufacturer, assuming it's a legitimate one, they may be indicating there that it is, in fact, a Staubli. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's that it may be that connector, because technically that's the only one that could advertise that it is an MC4. But in my reading on this, typically you try and match the one that's on the panel. If you can't, then the Staubli is kind of the Rolls Royce of connectors. So I would go with them, and just pay the little bit of extra money for it and make sure you got a good quality connector. Anybody else have any questions on it or anything? Okay, well, let me jump into some of the announcements for this week. There's a couple of, there's one this afternoon here on net metering 3.0. That's, of course, primarily California focused, but that's something. And then putting on the 20th, putting sustainability in practice. So that's another one through Solar Power World. And once again, with these webinars, I'm just making you aware that they exist. If you need the connection, you can contact me and I'll go ahead and send you my connection. But a better way is probably just Google search it, and you'll find it a lot faster than trying to wait on me to hold your hand on it. On June 21st, we have scalability and flexibility. Basically, how do you grow your business through outsourcing in the world of solar? This one here is, I'm having a little bit of trouble. Oh, this is the one from Green Energy Ohio on agrivoltaics. So that's coming up. There is a measure before the Ohio House about agrivoltaics. So I think they're addressing that. Solar United Neighbors has one coming up on June 28th regarding how to sell your home if there's solar there. I guess how to maximize return on that investment if you're selling your home. And July 11th, this is one about the new competitive edge. Obviously, it's somebody who manufactures N-type TOPCon solar technology. So TOPCon is just another cell configuration, and there's a lot of talk that this may become the new PERC cell. You know, it's just another way of getting a little more efficiency out of a solar cell. And PERC has kind of become a dominant technology in solar panels in recent years. That's, if I remember right, passive emitter reflective contact or something. Anyway, it has a little shiny contact on the bottom of the cell that bounces some power back up in. This is just another technology, so could be used. It's very wonky, I'm sure. Anyway, so that is what I had in the world of webinars. And I'm going to jump in then to our topic of the day. And I had asked Tony, who does solar EV installs or charging stations, manufactures those, to be our resident expert on this as I jump in. So I'm assuming, Tony, if you're on the call, I'll get started and then you just jump in and correct everything I'm saying and why what I'm saying is wrong. Anyway, so what the question that was being asked here was, should utilities be allowed to own EV charging stations? And this might be something that you might think may not have a whole lot of application to your life, but bear in mind, currently, according to what I've been reading, 7 states currently require that utilities require that they're the only ones who own public EV charging stations. So that's a big issue, and it's going before a lot of state houses right now as to how do we deal with this? Do the utilities own them? Do the car manufacturers own them? Do private third parties own them? If I am selling electricity to my car, do I have to become a utility? A lot of policy issues there. So I just wanted to jump in there and let people know that this is something that's going to become, it's already becoming an issue, but it's going to become a much, much, much bigger issue as more and more people purchase electric vehicles. And this chart sort of shows just some projections here as to what percentage of the vehicles by 2040 are going to be EV as opposed to internal combustion engines. Everything I'm seeing is throwing out numbers like 35, 40% by 2030 of being EV versus internal combustion. Some states are requiring it, like California, that they must be internal combustion engine, or that you cannot buy a new internal combustion engine by 2030. When we start looking at sales forecasts here, the BEVs, battery electric vehicles versus plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So if you sort of pair those together, then you can walk out the projections there and start to see that this industry is just in the beginning stages of going crazy. And some of these projections, I always like to sort of point out that the government is pretty much wrong about all projections. And in the world of solar, it seems they're always projecting conservatively. But I just looked here, in EV sales in the first quarter of 2023 are far outpacing what those projections would have predicted. So we're seeing like 162% increase over 2 years ago. So at this point, I'm going to let Tony, why don't you jump in and just at this stage about the growth of the EV industry and charging stations and the like. Just throw your 2 cents in.
Sure. So as somebody who's obviously been following this market for years now, one of the things that I'll do to get a sick laugh is periodically go back and look at some of the greatest, most well-respected consulting agencies in the world, the Deloittes, the JP Morgans, the McKinseys, and look at what their EV projections were in 2016 for 2020 or 2021. To put it politely, they were embarrassingly wrong, and they have been for every year that they've tried to make this prediction. So even if you're going to use conservative estimates, I think this is kind of a joke. I think for new kind of passenger vehicles, I would be shocked if that number was not 80% or more combo BEV or plug-in hybrids on the road by 2030. There's a lot of reasons for that we don't have to, well, we can get into that if you want, but maybe that's a separate conversation as to why I think that. But obviously all of this plays into the kind of the main conversation, which is the side on utilities. So Jay, I can jump into that now, or we can kind of hold off.
Okay, well,
kind of
yeah.
thoughts there.
Yeah, let me give just a little bit of background on it, because
Sure.
not everybody may be as deep into the weeds of this as you are, certainly, and even me. But when I look at some of these projections, and as you say, they're probably very, very conservative, and they're all over the place, really, when you start looking at them. Just versus currently, they're saying in 2023 there are about 120,000 public charging stations. Who knows if that's accurate, but that's what's out there. $4 billion industry. That compares with about 145,000 service stations, gas stations currently. I was trying to get a sense of it as I was looking at this. Now when they say public, I'm sure, like here in Marietta, I know that there are 2 charging units. I mean,
Yeah.
there's one at the library and there's another one at one park. So that's basically it, for this city of Marietta where I am. They're anticipating you're going to need somewhere between 500,000 and 1.2 million by the year 2030 of these systems, $24 billion industry. So the growth of the charging station world, which you live in, is certainly strong. Now, who's going to dominate that is the issue. But then also people need to understand there are different levels of charging stations. So level 1 is just plugging into an outlet in a home, and it's what usually comes with your vehicle for sure. I mean, in the back of my Prius was a cord that I can plug in and it'll charge the car. Then there's a level 2 charging station, which is a 240 volt, typically, charging station that charges it faster, but it's again, primarily used for home or office kind of charging. Some of these there are commercial options there. Some will accept credit cards and people can pay to charge there. About 52% of all of the installs of charging stations in 2022 were level 2. But these are considered most of them are non-networked. They're just basically dumb charging stations. They plug in, they're like a cord. That's basically how they work currently. But there is a movement towards smart charging stations, which I don't know, maybe we can touch on that, but as to how that's going to change our world, but that's definitely another one. And then the level 3 charging stations, and I just want to give people a sense of the investment cost here. There was an article I was looking at, and when they started looking at the costs of installing some of these level 3, they came down. It gets complicated because these have multiple ports on them and they vary. but they seem to fall at somewhere in the $30,000-$35,000 range per plug, per connecting port to charge a vehicle at a level 3. And these are the fast charging, DC charging. They range in size, if I remember right, from like 150 kilowatts, is that right, to about 450 kilowatts. And do these operate at 480 for the most part volts?
Correct.
400 Okay, so 480 volts. And so this is a major investment. And I think, at least in my mind, reading through this gets into a lot of where folks are, where the battle is gonna be in the future, in that somewhere between the level 2 and a level 3. I don't think anybody much cares about level 1. They're all going, yeah, whatever. If you want to plug in a toaster, that's fine. We don't care. But it is a marketplace where it's going to grow. Why would a business install? There are a lot of reasons, but it can be a revenue source. It can be just a billboard to show how green you are. You can keep people on your site, during the charging process. And when they started interviewing, a lot of businesses, basically 90% or more, say they will be installing charging infrastructure at their location. So that said, let me turn over, because really our focus was who's going to dominate this marketplace, right? Who's gonna be in control. So Tony, tell me a little bit about, I suspect you have opinions, right?
I do have opinions. So that, I think, is a much more important and maybe a longer discussion as far as how should we do charging in America or around the world. Maybe if we can put a pin in that and kind of first address, maybe from the bottom up, some of the arguments both for and against utilities taking a hold of this, right? So let's, this is not meant to be like split down the middle and be wishy-washy and moderate. This is just, you can be fanatical on one side or the other, but it's important to know what are the arguments on both sides. So let's start with the cons. Why shouldn't utility companies do charging? Okay. Maybe the most common example or cited reason why they shouldn't is that they're already a monopoly and they're going to continue that monopoly creep into other segments. This is probably an obnoxious example, but maybe proves the point. Like, we don't allow utility companies to build houses just because there's a shortage, even though houses use a lot of electricity, and it could be a great source of whatever for the utility companies. We don't allow them because they're like, hey, you're a monopoly. Your job is to provide electricity. It's not to do these other things. Now, when we get to charging, that's a little bit closer to home, because that's, at least 50 or 80% of a charger is figuring out the energy that feeds it and pushing and pulling it where it needs to go. That argument that, hey, they're a monopoly and shouldn't be allowed to kind of crush the little guy or crush competition is one that most states will use who do not allow utilities to install EV charging infrastructure. The second argument is, okay, let's say that we allow them to do that. Who pays for it? And so this is typically either rate hikes on the folks in their geographic region, which then you have a complaint. One, that just prices of energy are going up, or two, hey, I don't want to subsidize your hippie tree hugging EV. Why should I have to pay for it? And then it's like, well, if it's not that, it's usually some combination of rate hikes and tax incentives. So reallocating tax dollars anyway to build this additional revenue stream for a monopoly, right? That doesn't brief well, again, as you can imagine, in most places. The places where things like sometimes you'll hear these terms of like riders, and there's special charges for folks that money is supposed to go to. In this case, if there was a rider for charging infrastructure, we're going to slice this little dollar amount off and do public charging infrastructure with it. That's often cited as routinely used by utility companies in a fraudulent or semi-fraudulent way. My favorite HB House Bill 6, they found there was a $168 million rider for grid modernization. $0 went to grid modernization, right? So there's like, just because you have something in there to do a thing doesn't mean that they're actually going to do that thing, right? So, okay, let's say we allow them to do it, then we can maybe figure out a way to pay for it. The kind of the last argument shot across the bow as you're leaving the room with your middle finger up is, well, they're a monopoly, so the service will suck. There's no competition, so they're just not going to care, right? And so like that's the con section. The pro section is the argument would be, well, public charging infrastructure already sucks, and it sucks very badly. It would be very hard to suck harder than it does right now. And we're seeing this play out in real time with, from my perspective, wild, embarrassing genuflecting from, folks like Ford and GM, and as of today, Rivian, ditching the CCS standard, the combined charging standard, and going to the NACS standard, which is effectively Tesla's charging standard. And they're doing that because public charging infrastructure, specifically supercharging infrastructure, sucks so bad. And that folks like EVgo or Electrify America or ChargePoint or Blink just simply haven't done an adequate job supporting the CCS standard. And the Fords and the GMs of the world are concerned that if that problem is not solved, and they are an electric vehicle company, it will bankrupt their company. And I think that is not a dramatic position to take. I think that that's probably accurate.
Are they wanting to piggyback on like Tesla's 25,000 charging stations? Is that what they're looking for?
Yes, that's exactly correct. So Tesla, for all EV drivers, like the number one decision when I went to buy an EV was on charging infrastructure reliability and quality. That's why I ended up with the Tesla, because it's not even close. And so what they much more on the supercharging network side. Level 1, as you described, level 2, these are glorified extension cords. The supercharging infrastructure is really what matters. And often when someone will show up to a charger, it'll be broken. There'll be some ridiculous payment gateway that they have to go through. They have to install 7 different apps on a road trip. The hardware sucks. The software sucks, right? There's just like it's a real poor experience. Tesla, you pull up and you charge. Everything is done. The payment is through your phone, but it doesn't prompt you. It's plug in, it's pull up and charge, right? And so all of these other large automakers are now looking to tap into the Tesla network and the Tesla charging standard to solve, this huge gap in services. Now, there's a separate discussion that we could have on what are the pros and cons of ditching the CCS standard for NACS, which is the North American charging standard. But maybe lastly, on the utility pro side, hey, things suck already. Also, public charging infrastructure players are also propped up by tax subsidies, or in Electrify America's case, blood money from Dieselgate. And so it's not really like all is fair and kind of white glove on the public charging utility or public charging infrastructure players right now. And lastly, I think I've heard arguments pro utility that if you allow a for-profit model to exist, you will never have, in the next decade, you will not have adequate public charging infrastructure in low income or rural areas, because no one's going to make that trade-off. No one's going to put a $250,000 system in the ground in the middle of nowhere that'll take 100 years to pay back. But if it was a little bit more for public good kind of utility style that is much more, or could even be a mandated outcome. So that's kind of the pro, and both the pro and the con positions on the utility side.
Okay, so if I'm a state legislator and you present those issues to me, then I think there would be it would be appealing to just come down and say, okay, guys, you know, both of you can now participate, public, private, duke it out, and let's see who wins. That's free enterprise. But there are some problems inherent in that if you allow the utility to compete against non-utility players in the same marketplace. So maybe you could point out a couple of those issues that suddenly arise. I'm thinking specifically around demand charges.
Sure.
You know, the fact that the utility is basically the supplier to their competition.
That's right.
So I'm sure there's no incentive there to make life difficult for them. And
exactly. And this is another kind of huge potential issue going into the con category. You could say, like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, just scream free market and throw Atlas Shrugged at people and let it happen. But the reality of the situation is, if it is, you know, utility company versus big or small private player, one, they have to just, the inherent difficulty of competing with a monopoly. But let's say that they win or are winning as far as deployments are concerned. One, I don't even know what that would mean, right? Because you would do some kind of, Tesla's very good at this. You do some kind of traffic pattern of life analysis on where the routes are and where, you know, highest utilization would be. And so let's say that that's at a you know, the corner of Main Street and McDonald's. Do I put mine in there, or do you, Mr. Utility, put yours in there?
Mhm.
And if I say I want it in there first, and you just drag your feet on the permitting to connect to the grid, or to drop in transformers, or to do all of the grid upgrades necessary for supercharging, or even lower levels of public charging, that just inherently does not sound like it's going to be a great idea. Because even if you can somehow beat the utility to the punch with the physical charging infrastructure, they still hold all the power when it comes down to approving your interconnection, doing any construction necessary for that interconnection, and then ultimately providing you power for that charging station. Again, like that doesn't sound, certainly does not sound fair in any stretch of the imagination.
Mm-hmm. So there's now, let's talk about a little bit about demand charges there, because if I'm the owner of a gas station, for example, and I say, oh, I see that they're beginning to transition from the internal combustion engine to the world of electric vehicles, I want to throw in a few charging stations, get my feet wet here. How does that impact the bill, and can I make a profit at this?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Typically, in order to avoid what is potentially bankrupting peak demand charges, these sites have to be metered separately from the main business operations, right? If you have some kind of nutso 250 kilowatt supercharger and you've got 8 of them in your Sheetz parking lot, that probably has nothing to do with the amount of energy that is necessary to keep your lights on and to keep the hot dog machine running, right? So these are typically permitted as at 2 separate things. This again is another potential vector for utility companies to play dirty with private installers, because they could just be like, hey, this was your highest, whatever, 15, 30 minute usage per month. Enjoy that peak demand charge. Why that doesn't bankrupt everywhere it's at is that those are typically metered separately from everything else, so that the swing in power is not an aberration from the average. But certainly something that I think will continue to be a larger and larger deal. And I think who puts them in and how that, there's too much energy, no pun intended, put in on who puts these things in, right? Because there's a larger discussion to be had on like, why does EV charging infrastructure suck? And I think a lot of it is tied. It's not random that the hands down the best charging user experience is connected to the company that has decided to roll them out for their own vehicles and customers, right? There's that seamless interoperability. Whenever somebody pushes an update, they're pushing an update across all their vehicles and their charging infrastructure. It's just meant to fit hand in glove, whereas everyone else is completely chaotic, right? If someone wants to upgrade charging speed or make a tweak on the battery or something else on the software side, there's effectively zero chance that that'll be done at all, much less in a high quality way, with the kind of the Wild West non-Tesla standards out there. Now, this bending of the knee that has happened, we're talking about this is just weeks old. Like, this is very, very recent that Ford and GM are claiming that they're going to switch over to effectively the Tesla standard. People make a comment a lot about the difference of the charging cable head between CCS and Tesla. Tesla's is obviously way more sleek, way smaller, more reliable, etc. But to me, that's absolutely missing the forest for the trees, because there's so much else that goes into the standards of an industry besides the plug face, that are still really up in the air, right? Like, will Tesla allow anyone else other than Tesla to build and deploy chargers for everyone? We don't know. Will they allow their chargers to be vehicle to grid? We don't know. We know that Tesla themselves doesn't believe that, because they have this other cool product called a Powerwall, and it would cannibalize their own sales. And so again, like, this is a wild surrender to GM and Ford's #1 competitor. You know, they've effectively turned over the gas station to their #1 competitor. And I just think that, you know, we might be in for a little bit of a bumpy ride here.
Well, and as we transition to smart charging stations, aren't you basically turning over the operating system to a manufacturer? Just like the battle between Apple and Microsoft. I mean, these things, you talked about updates, but what about charging station 1.0 versus 1.1 versus 2.0? And if competitors are trying to market Tesla-like charging stations, but Tesla changes the way these things function, and now it sounds like turning over charging to manufacturers of vehicles can be problematic in many ways. It may be the most seamless experience, but now it's also creating, without regulation, without somebody coming in and saying, you will adhere to these rules.
Yes.
There's going to be problems there.
Yeah, and that was the whole point behind the combined charging standard, CCS, was that, all right, we can't have a dozen different car companies have a dozen different charging cables and standards, communication protocols. So how do we standardize this across the industry? At that time, CHAdeMO, the Japanese standard, existed. Then there was Tesla, then there was CCS, and that was it. Then CHAdeMO died and everybody jumped on CCS. So it was essentially CCS and Tesla. And those were the two, and that was fine, because you had the biggest and baddest and best EV company with its own standard, and then literally everyone else trying to play catch up on CCS. This shift, I think, to the North American charging standard, which Tesla just renamed their charging standard to be like less in your face. I think a lot of it being cited as like this great victory for simplification and for EV owners. I look at it kind of the complete opposite of that. We were coalescing behind a Tesla standard for Tesla vehicles and a everyone else standard for everyone else, and now that has been muddied in a way that I honestly don't understand how or why GM or Ford would allow such a thing. They were apparently so scared or incapable of creating a reliable charging experience that they would rather surrender not only all that potential revenue, but the potential strategic stranglehold on their entire company to their number one competitor. So we'll see where this goes.
Well, speaking of standardization, back with the world of utilities, utilities are typically geographically restricted in nature, and charging infrastructure is not. In fact, the incentives are such that they're looking at these charging corridors, essentially interstate highway system corridors, and saying, okay, we're going to subsidize the development of these along these corridors. We need to look at the long haul charging infrastructure. And now you've got all these different utilities all patchworked across, each one wanting to own the infrastructure. How sure are we there will be interoperability between those systems, just like we're talking about interoperability between manufacturing systems?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is rather self-evident. If you look at how great are we at seamless operation and integration and transportation distribution of energy across multiple warring fiefdoms, not great. So I think it's logical to then assume that there'd be a kind of a similar rollout of EV charging infrastructure if utilities were allowed to do this. Some places that would have more and some places would have less, and it would depend on the whims or the business decisions of these utilities in these geographically constrained regions on not only how many but the type, right? Because I've heard arguments that say, like, we're just going to just sprinkle glorified extension cords everywhere, and that will be the charging infrastructure of the future. It's cheap. It's 240. It's not like super complex. You don't need to drop crazy transformers in the ground or do any type of insane site work. You just have to connect it to a standard single phase 240 outlet. So I don't think that's great for some folks, but I don't think that's a realistic solution, particularly as we look at larger electric SUVs and trucks coming on board. Just the time it would take to get a full charge, even on a 5 or 7 kilowatt level 2 charger, is insane. So I think that there needs to be probably a higher base building block. When you're looking at 120 or 150 or 200 kilowatt hour battery pack like in the Hummer, I certainly don't think and hope that is not the default, but you're not going to charge a 200 kilowatt hour battery pack with a 5 kilowatt charger. That's just not something they're going to do. Now, I don't think it would require a 150 kilowatt supercharger, but from my perspective, there's a lot of other numbers between 5 and 150 that might be more suitable and cost effective for folks who are driving EVs.
Okay, well, we've got just a few more minutes here, but I thus thought we'd open it up to people on the call. Does anybody have a question specifically towards Tony? I can answer it, but I'll give you a wrong answer. So anybody have anything they were thinking of as we were discussing?
Yeah, Jay.
Yeah, Bob.
Way back when electric cars started to get into favor, I sat and said, what's the sense if we're taking fossil fuels from gasoline and changing it to gas-fired generators on the grid? This is not going to help global warming in any way whatsoever.
Okay, so I
So
want one of those.
the promise was always to go to renewable energy to charge these batteries. So if I had a Tesla and how many solar panels do I have to put on my roof to charge the thing?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Tony, do you have a specific response to that? I can throw out something.
Yeah, well, the most accurate answer is it depends on how fast you want to charge. Part of what we identified is, Bob, to your point, it still is better environmentally and certainly for local air quality, even if you get 100% of your power to your EV from a coal burning power plant. That is still better than, and we can go get into the math if you'd like, on a internal combustion engine vehicle, but absolutely not the best we could do. So from our perspective, if you continue to kind of peel back the onion, and I think Jay is a master at this, kind of showcasing all of what's behind the scenes on the solar side, you really kind of have, from our perspective, not saying this is fact, but from our perspective, this kind of insane grid-based power electronics ecosystem where you're racing to take DC from solar and push it to the grid, flip it to AC and push it to the grid as fast as humanly possible. And so we think that that's probably not the future of energy, that if solar is DC and stationary batteries are DC and your EV is DC, then you should keep things on the DC side as fast as humanly possible. To like directly answer your question, so you can get like a 30 kilowatt solar array that would cover like 6 parking spaces, to kind of give you an idea on what that is and does. Now, obviously from there, there's a lot of places you can go. You can have that array refill a battery so that you could charge faster than what you're able to get out of the solar panels directly themselves. So, it just keep the math simple. You could have a 100 kilowatt or 150 kilowatt hour battery pack that you fill up with 30 kilowatts of solar at a time, but you can still discharge it at like a supercharging rate for your electric vehicle and still be 100% renewable. That's just like one example. There's a company called Beam that has pretty quick back in and drop solar canopy for 1 parking space. No grid interconnection, no nothing, just straight solar to car. That's at like a 3 kilowatt, maybe 5 kilowatt range. I think it's 3. So certainly not fast charging, but none of this like crazy infrastructure permitting nonsense that you have to go through, and 100% kind of right from the sun, right to your car. So kind of a few different ways to think about that very good question, Bob.
Yeah, and if it's on a residential system, then I would just recommend you treat it like another load, and you just size your residential system accordingly. And that's going to be dependent on how much you drive and, what kind of vehicle you're dealing with and all of that. But it would just be one more load. Speaking of residential, one of the issues I'm running into is looking at how we can do bidirectional charging, and the marketplace, at least for the moment, seems to be talking up bidirectional charging without having the product to back it up. They're saying you can do this in theory, but in practice, and I'll specifically talk about Enphase because this is my experience at the moment. They came out with an Enphase, in quotes, it's from Clipper Creek, but it was like a Enphase charger.
Yeah.
But which made me think from all their advertising, it's bidirectional. Turns out it's not. And then they came out with their auto disconnect that is in fact bidirectionally compatible, but it's not, because I just bought one and they said, yes, it is. And then finally, after the order was placed, they go, oh, no, that'll be coming out next year. And so you're going, okay, does that mean I get to trade in this $2,000 piece of equipment next year for the one that I really wanted? Or does that mean I got to wait a year before I install the system that I'd like to have? And so that's a frustration at the residential level, but whether the utility's involved or not, that's going to continue to be a frustration.
So who's going to be the bigger user? The guy going cross country or the guy at home?
Oh, well, within EV charging, of course, today, most of it is charging at home, charging at work. That's just kind of the reality of people's lives. But the thing they all worry about is, what if I decide to drive to the Grand Canyon? How am I going to charge my charging station? Well, that becomes a problem on that trip. But as far as what percentage of your driving is that kind of driving, it's relatively small. So I think what we're focused on here today is how do we deal with that with public charging stations, and those are typically for longer trips. That seems to be when people use those. If you're just commuting back and forth to work and there's a charging station at work and there's a charging station at home, it's usually not an issue,
Well, we can use the great commuter system on trains going out to the different cities we have in America.
Yeah, just plug into the train and then just use the cord like a tether, and it'll take you where you need to go. See, problem solved.
I like the way you think.
Okay, so we've only got just 2 or 3 more minutes here. So Tony, you got any last minute thoughts on the whole issue, or even projections of where you think it's going to end up?
Yeah, well, real quick in the chat, there's battery exchange system. Where does battery exchange system play? I'm assuming that's like a battery swapping station. To put it bluntly, they have failed in every place in the world that they've ever been tried for 2 reasons. The first is cost. You're taking the most expensive part of an electric vehicle, its battery, and you're making multiples of those to support an individual car. Now, it's not multiple batteries per car, but on average, it is more than 1 battery per car. It has to be for battery swapping. So there's a tremendous cost component to this. But the real reason that it failed is the standardization across the industry. There's no cost-effective way to have a car pull in, drop, and swap a battery, because there's no standardization on that exact process, 1, across multiple EV makers, and 2, what is becoming more popular is the concept of using the EV as a structural element, EV battery as a structural element to the vehicle itself. So again, that further complicates the likelihood or cost effectiveness that there can be kind of this ubiquitous battery swapping station. And we've tried this some in the United States, kind of small pilot scale. In Israel, it was a thing. In China, it was a huge thing. Continues to be a thing, but it's almost 100% subsidized by the government there. It's failed everywhere else. It's been rolled out for those reasons. It would be cool. It would be fast, but making it work across multiple EV makers effectively has not been able to happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so where do you think ownership issues are going to end up at nationwide?
For charging?
Yeah, for charging infrastructure.
I think there'll probably be 1 or 2 players for public supercharging cross-country network. And I think for everything else, it will be destination chargers or home chargers.
Okay. Are you thinking more in terms of the fact that because of this infrastructure, there is such a reliability on cross-platform compatibility, the networking aspect of it, that it may emerge similar to the PC marketplace, where there became dominant operating systems of Apple and Microsoft, maybe
Yes.
a lot of different people who make the bits,
Yes.
that utilize that. And then it just wouldn't function if there were 75 different operating systems.
Yeah. I think on the public charging side, on the supercharging side, that is certainly true. There's also just like a lot of overlap to your previous point on, you got to make these things seamless. They can't be like the fiefdoms of utilities. Somebody has to take a national vision on where should these things be located based on traffic patterns and driving patterns, and where are the optimal places to start and stop for a trip. And Tesla has the lead because they're the only ones that have had the intestinal fortitude to roll these systems out when everyone else was complaining about CapEx. They have the information, and they've successfully done it. Not only have they've done it, but they've done it better than anyone else in the United States. So it's hard for me to imagine a world, a supercharging world, a cross-country network world where there's any more than one other non-Tesla player in that. And that will solve range anxiety. So that's a great thing. That's a good thing. And I think for everything else, and one of the many advantages that I found with an EV is you realize how silly it is to go to an extra location for the energy for your transportation. That's like a silly thing to do. If you can do it where you live, or you can do it where you shop or where you work, that's pretty great that you don't have to plan this separate trip into your life. So I think the majority of charging infrastructure will be done at home, at work, or or destination based. And then there'll be one or two kind of, as you pointed out, very kind of standardized large players across the country to solve the range anxiety problem.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to cut off the discussion right there. I really want to thank you, Tony, for stepping in, and thank everybody for paying attention. And we'll do this all again next Tuesday. So we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks
a
everybody.
lot. Mhm.
Thank you.